I'm Mattania. I'm an artist and an engineer, and today I'll be taking you along on the journey of how I built an interactive art installation for Toro y Moi. Let's get into it. So crazy enough, this entire collaboration was actually sparked from a TikTok. So around this time last year, I posted a TikTok of me turning my painting into a musical instrument, and I used a Toro song as the audio, and that blew up way more than I expected it to. So while that was like circling around the internet, Chaz actually ended up seeing it and reached out and DM'd me, was like, hey, loved your video, thanks for using my song. I have this event coming up in September. Would you like to do an installation at it? And you know, I of course said yes. So the event was actually a camping concert set in the Big Sur Forest. It was called 2 Days of Music. A couple months before the show, me and some of the Toro team went down in advance to get a scope of the venue. So after we got the chance to tour the campgrounds and just basically get a good general vibe of what the event was going to be like, I went home and I started brainstorming. The first step in the brainstorming process for me is always moodboarding. I'll take you along and show you what I put together. I'll talk you through the different elements and basically walk you through what specifically I liked about these images. Working with silhouettes a lot, so lots of sort of themes of cutouts or like frames of people. I knew I wanted to make this piece interactive, and so to do that, I wanted to have a camera component. And so with that in mind, designing around the idea of being able to pull in a silhouette. You sort of see here me playing around with like feedback loops or cutout type vibe or like this thresholds screen print look. This is actually crazy. This is light photography. So essentially these are like light beams and someone's like running around this person. I think it's like long exposure photography, whatever. I'm not a photographer, but basically this isn't an LED screen. This is actually just like a light bar that someone was running around, which is pretty insane. Here, this very stereotypical psychedelic that wanted to sort of incorporate that like trippy acid type vibe. This is sort of like orb-esque. I would classify these both as orb-esque, the two different spectrums of orb, like glowy orb and like, I don't know what you would call this, sort of like that microscopic type, like evolving. Again, talking about layering, but also nature because it's an outdoor concert. So here we have this sort of orby overlaid over these mountains. One of Toro's frequent collaborators who was on the sort of site visit, his name is Jamie. He ended up filming the entire site visit on his camcorder. So he had some B-roll footage that he sent over to me that I was able to use. I actually got that pretty far in advance before I started designing. So it was nice that I was able to sort of see the footage and design around that. And then we got this more like classic 70s type vibe of these different floral or just like oil elements. And this image here is actually one of Chaz's paintings. I was super inspired by it. I love the sort of like organic scribbles. Also love a checkerboard. Love a distorted checkerboard even. Pulling inspiration from his shapes and the general like composition of things. And these images here are clearly obviously Toro y Moi merch. It was a collab that they did with Brain Dead for Mahal. I love Brain Dead. I love all the work they put out. We have like the nice natural shades of like green and blue, very earthy tones. Obviously the Brain Dead logo, but has this sort of like textural vibe to it. Also really liked this one, even though it's less directly nature, it still has that vibe to it with the colors and just shapes and how they're all connected. Thought it would be nice to take inspiration from the merch and also sort of tie that back into the actual artwork. After I moodboard, I always like going into sketch phases next. Right off the bat, you can see me playing with the idea of circles. We have like these overlapping circles here, using a circle as a sort of cutout window. But this is sort of directly inspired by the Soul Trash album cover, having that as like a frame for people. Again, using circles as a sort of like holder for footage of water, overlapping shapes. I was thinking about sort of having this like intersection where it's like at each intersection there was like a different color, having this sort of like aura that like exhibits out of this person. Playing around with frames, having different textures in them, and then having these different like evolving shapes. Here we have this organic shape that's like evolving in the center. Each sort of like row of circles have its own like rotational value. So having animation make these simple shapes really interesting. Again, silhouettes. This was like the one layout that I was most excited about. I like thought of it randomly and like grabbed my sketchbook and went for it. In this sort of like organic waveform. So I made 10 visuals in total. Since there are 2 nights, I planned on showing 5 each night, looping through each visual for about 2 minutes and automatically progressing to the next one and essentially just looping through those 5 throughout the night. So I would say unlike my other design projects, the sketch phase was much more of like general brainstorming as opposed to here are the layouts I'm actually going to execute on. This was my first time using touchdesigner, and so with that, I didn't really know what I could do. I started sketching before I went through tutorials, specifically because I didn't want to be too influenced by the actual tutorials I was watching. I wanted to be able to pick up the skills and apply it to my original ideas. So now I'm going to give an overview of how I built one of the visuals. Just want to give a warning in advance. This probably is not going to be the most in-depth touch designer tutorial, just because that would make this video like 3 hours long. I'm going to try my best to briefly share my process as opposed to getting too much into the weeds of things, just so that the casual viewer who doesn't have the desire of sitting through a very long, technical, in-depth tutorial can still watch and enjoy this video. However, if you are looking for more in-depth tutorials on touch designer, like what's a top, what's a stop, what's a chop, I will link the resources I learned from below because they will probably teach you a lot better than I can. So with that, let's get into building things. So this is Touch Designer. This is where all the magic happens. So you can see here, it's a visual node-based programming language. So each of these squares is its own sort of function or node, and they all link together to build this network of things to come up with a beautiful output like this. I'm gonna be walking you through how I built this visual. So we are gonna take everything and delete and start with a fresh slate. To start off, we actually are gonna do one of the easy things and sort of add one of the default options that Touch Designer has. Drop in the checker here. So these are sort of pre-built visuals that Touch Designer has. If you like click into this, you can see this whole like network of how this checkerboard is made. It's sort of nice that they have these default things to sort of get going off the ground with. And so let's go ahead and change this checkerboard to be 4x4, take out the transparency on that one, and change the resolution to 1920 to 1080. And let's go ahead and add a fun colors here. So let's do a blue. Feeling lots of cool tones lately, so let's do a blue and a green. Okay. Okay, I like that. Let's do that. So now that we have our colors, we want to have that like wavy sort of like effect that it had to it. So to do that, we're going to add a displace. Connect it to the first sort of option here. And to make that sort of wave effect, we are going to have to randomly generate those numbers. So let's go ahead and go into our chop, add a noise chop, fiddle around with the options a bit. So let's make this 0.25 and then the exponent to 1.27, amplitude to 1.67, and offset to 2.81. And then let's go ahead and go into our transform. And we want to have this like sort of move over time. So we're going to go ahead and add apps time dot seconds. Also, let's increase the period a bit, so it's a bit more like stretched out. So now we have this sort of like randomly generated graph of values that is moving very slow. So let's go ahead and speed that up by 10 times 10. Cute. So now we have this like graph of number values and this sort of like visual. So let's go ahead and connect the two. So to do that, we have to add a chop to drag and drop it into that, but it converts the number values into sort of something that can be read by pixels. And so we drop it in, we get this sad looking thing, but it is not the sad looking thing that we want. So let's change the displace weight by 0 and change the displace weight by Y by 0.01. Okay, let's do repeat for the option there. Okay, cute. I'm happy with that. If I want to make the wave a bit more like funkier, then I can go into the noise and play around with these values. I just chose these values before because it was what I liked visually, but feel free to go around and change any number values because that will change the way it looks. So cool. Now that we have our funky background that's like moving and waving and gyrating and such, let's go ahead and add the bouncy balls that were there before. And so to do that, we are going to move over here and add a circle sop. And then we are going to click here and add a geometry node. Now what else do we want to do? Let's go ahead and add a camera, a light, and then we want to render what we got so far. So let's go to render top and add that. You can see here it automatically connects things. I'm going to hide the viewers there because it's just kind of messy. We don't really need to see that. We don't need to see all that. I want this to be like a flat white thing. I don't like the shininess we got going on. So let's go ahead and add a Fong material to change the way that it's rendered. I'll just throw it in the top there since that's what we're doing. So to change that, we're going to go into the geo, go into render, and then we're going to drag and drop the Fong material into that option there. And so now when I click on my Fong, I can reduce the shininess and just have that flat whiteness. So now we have all of these nodes just to render this like single circle. It seems so extra, but I promise there's a reason to the things I'm doing. Just trust the process. We want to essentially take this circle that we have and create duplicates of it and have those duplicates sort of randomly move about on their own. So one way that we could do this is just by like literally copying and pasting this over and over again. But if we do that, then we would have to go into each of these circles and sort of manually set the animation values. And that's a lot of work. We don't want to do that. To avoid manually going in and having to do all of this, what we can do is essentially create instances of it. So to create an instance, we are going to go into the noise chop. And then once we're in the noise, we can go to the channel and we want to set 3 different channels here. So TX, TY, and TZ. This is going to be the rate of movement. Change your end values to 12 and this drop down to samples. So now we want to make these sort of like number values move. And so we're going to go into transform, go to absolute and set this value to absolute time dot seconds times 0.1. Moving a bit, not too crazy, not too wild. And now let's go into the noise and we're going to say 1.95 for the seed, 0.03 for the period, 0.238 for the roughness, and 9.24 for the amplitude. Let's go ahead and add a null container. This is just an empty container. It doesn't do anything, like I said. Let's change this, rename it to movement, just so we know that we're moving. Okay, so now we're going to go back into the geometry, go into instancing, the first tab, and we want to turn it on. Now, and then the translate OP, we're going to set that to movement. And then TX and TY, we are going to set those to translate X, translate Y. And look at that. We have all of these fun moving circles and we didn't even have to copy paste things. See, that is the power of programming. I think we have too many. We don't want that many. For some reason it changed to 700. I don't know how it got there. 12, this is what we want. This is what we love to see. So let's go ahead, set that as a background so we can see what's going on. And we want to make these circles smaller, just as a personal preference, 0.45. Cute, we like that. Now we have our sort of bouncy balls here and we have our funky sort of checkerboard going on there. So let's combine the two. Let's go ahead and add a null top just to set at the very end. Let's rename that background and remove these as the display options and have that as the display option. To combine these sort of two elements we got going here, we're going to add a composite and surprise, composite them. So now we drag and drop those options there, and then we drag the composite to our background element. Now we have this sort of spotlight-esque effect going on, which is cute, but it's not what I want. So let's go ahead and change the operation to difference. And now we're cooking. This is exactly what I wanted. I am happy with this. And now that we have this final visual going on, like feel free to go in and like change these values. Changing one sort of number value can make things really funky. Yeah, I don't know, have fun with it. Make it unique, make it your own. So now we have this pattern going on, but we want to make it interactive. So to do that, let's go ahead and add our camera component. So this is the camera we're going to use for the installation. I'll go into more details on why I specifically chose this camera later on in the video, but for now, all you need to know is that it's a USB security camera and it has night vision, which is what we're going to use for this project. Let's go ahead and add the camera layer and we are going to add video device in. Change the device to the HG USB camera and look at me, there I am. Oh, that is meta. Look at that feedback loop going on there. You can kind of see it switching from like color to black and white mode. That's essentially it switching from RGB mode to infrared. Infrared mode is the night vision and that's what we want to keep it in because that's how we can like sort of get the threshold and like do body segmentation with it. With this sort of black and white creepy feed we got going on, okay, so what do we want to actually do with this camera feed? We are going to create a threshold out of this. So you see how my hand moves closer, how like it gets whiter and the further I back away, it sort of grays out. That is sort of it understanding the depth. So what we want to do is essentially add a threshold and drop it there and connect those two items. And look at that, we have a threshold. You can play around with like the threshold values, keep it low key like that. Cool, so now that we have a threshold, let's go ahead and turn this back on. So let's go ahead and color this a bit. Add a lookup. and add a ramp. This is essentially how we can recolor items. Let's click on the ramp and change the black value to be transparent. We want to keep that transparency there. Let's click on the other end of the spectrum and color it. Let's add a pink. I like pink. So now let's go ahead and connect the lookup to the composite. And look at that. She's beautiful. She's so fun. I feel like a Jabberwocky. Okay, that is not what they do. Now that I showed you how I built one of 10 visuals, I'm gonna give like a speed run of how I built some other ones. Like I said before, if I went through each one in depth, it would be so long of a video. And I start off with this one. This one actually isn't interactive, but I think it has like the wildest stuff going on. If I turn off the background, you can see how absurd it is, which is why I started off with a simpler one, but it's kind of fun to see like the network of things and how things are all connected. I had like the B-roll footage that I shrunk down and I masked it into this circle. I sort of had this shadow element in the background. If like I bypass it, you can kind of see the shadow disappear. And what else? The wave thing. The way I did this is I added like this rectangle with like this outline, and I layered another rectangle on top of it. So I just had like this like flat form. I blurred it a bit and then I recolored it with the ramp. Then I used displacement to get this like funky wave thing going on there. How did I get these bouncing things? This is going to be a reminder for me as well. I haven't touched this file in months, so I'm relearning what I did alongside with you. I created 3 different rectangles, and I have this crazy network of LFOs, which are just basically like sine waves, I think that's right. You see how it like slides to the right, pauses, and then goes back? That's basically a representation of this number value. Taking a copy of that, delaying each sort of step by like 0.1 or 0.2 seconds or so. So yeah, that's how I did that. How I got this like funky thing in the background. I had a rectangle, and then I used one of touchdesigner's pre-built things called Feedback Edge. So I played around with the settings, and I basically got this like pulsating like rectangles that are layered on top of each other. And then yeah, I composited it all together to create that speed round. So with this one, I have like these 4 ovals that I layer together, and I blur them so they kind of like fade into each other a bit. And then I do displacement again, recolored it with these values, and then I keyed out the white values to be transparent, and then the transparent values to be black, and then I just layered the B-roll underneath it. So that's how I got this like warpy window. What else? Speed round, speed round, speed round. What did I do here? So I created a grid of circles essentially that each have their sort of, whoa, where am I? I created this very weird like grid of circles that are layered on top of each other. I don't even know what's going on here, if I'm being honest. There, you can see better in the render. And then I blurred that, and then I created a noise top, which is this like cloudy like thing. This is also randomly generated. I displaced these blurred out grid of circles by the noise to get this sort of cool effect. Change the black and white values to this sort of gradient effect to colorize it like that. And then I have these animating circles, these sort of left and right circles that are like bouncing back and forth. I'm doing that same sort of animation, mathematically generated. Composited together with the previous texture that we had, but then I added a mirror top to have 2 layers on top of each other. So it's basically, you know what a mirror is. I don't need to explain what a mirror is. And then I colorized the circles to be different, layered the circles on top of that original background to create this crazy planet Earth type animation. Speed round, speed round, speed round. This is also a crazy network. This one took me the longest. It was like the most complex one. God, what am I doing here? Let's start with the checkerboard, because that's simple enough. So I created this checkerboard by using that default thing I had, rotating it, have this noise gradient that I'm essentially displacing that by to get this like even funkier checkerboard going on. Did some coloring things, and then I just moved it down, contained it into this tiny box in the corner there. So that's one element. Another element, this like left box here, how did I do that? I created another noise, colored it to be this sort of like orby thing, limit it to the left side in that little rectangle. I have my sort of default footage that I created so I didn't have to keep on waving my hand back and forth in front of the camera. Also displacing. I think displacement is probably my favorite top in touchdesigner. Displacing it so I could get like this sort of choppy vibe to it, blurring it, coloring it, layering it on top of that. We have that little flower in the background, center it, animating the rotation value. Oh, this was the hardest thing. The sort of rotating background we have. So I have my B-roll cropped and layered on top of this green background. What else am I doing? I am animating it. But how am I animating it? Oh, I don't even want to know how I'm animating it. All of these, this entire section here, oh my God, I cannot select. Oh my God, help. Help! Okay, this entire section here, this entire section is just to animate that rectangle up and down. So touch designer, I feel like sometimes you have to do the most simplest things. But then once you really learn the tool, you can kind of do anything with it, which makes it fun in the end. And so I'm also doing that feedback edge that I showed in the last example, rotating that back and forth, layered that underneath that B-roll footage that we got going to create this crazy composition. I thought I was gonna do an overview of all of the other visuals, but honestly, I'm tired of talking, so that's all you're getting from me. So I got this inflatable projection screen for the installation, and here you can see me struggling to set it up for the first time. This wasn't exactly my first choice in display. I really didn't like the chunky black frame of it all. I feel like it just would have been much more immersive if there was just no borders around it. But since the installation was outdoors, we really had to account for weather, so we had to have a stable enough base to make sure that the wind didn't knock it over. This display also came with two screens, one for front projection and one for rear projection, which was super helpful. It was important to have rear projection for this installation just because that meant the projector could be behind the screen. So when people were to step in front of the piece and interact with it, they wouldn't have their shadows cast onto the actual screen. Doing rear projection meant that the fabric had to be slightly thinner to allow for the light to pass through, which also meant that the projector had to be just a bit stronger to make sure that the colors and the contrast didn't get washed out. So now onto the projector. I rented an Epson Powerlight L730U, and I will say this projector was quite pricier than your average home projector, so I don't necessarily recommend it if you're just getting started on smaller projects, but I ended up choosing it just because it had the specs that I needed. There are a couple things you want to keep in mind when sourcing a projector: lumen count and throw distance. Lumens are a measurement of the brightness that a projector gives out. The higher the lumen count, the brighter the light. I needed a minimum of 7,000 lumens for this, just because it was going to be outdoors. The second thing to look out for is throw distance. Throw distance is the distance from the tip of the projector's lens to the screen. The further from the screen, the larger the image. When researching different projector models, I used this online calculator to determine how far back the projector had to be placed in order to fill the full width of the projection screen. This also helped determine the length of the cables that I needed to connect the camera to my computer, which leads me to my last component, the camera. I would say most creative tech installations typically end up using the Azure Connect for their sensor, and I would honestly recommend using that if you have the option to. The Azure Connect comes with additional sensors that gives you more data to play with. However, it is on the pricier side and is only compatible with Windows devices, so it wasn't the best option for me since I only had my trusty MacBook Pro to work with. I ended up finding these USB security cameras with night vision to use instead. I particularly like this camera model because it had a 90-degree wide viewing angle, which meant that people can be positioned on different ends of the screen and still could get picked up by the camera. Since the installation was going to be active after sunset, that meant that the camera had to have night vision. Now, the way that the camera is built, it switches between RGB and infrared mode based on the current lighting of the room. It can measure the current lighting through this tiny sensor here called a photoresistor. While this is a pretty useful feature for a camera if you're actually using it for security purposes, I wasn't, so I wanted to force the camera to be in infrared mode all the time. So to do that, I did the world's most complex hardware hack and covered the photoresistor with a black piece of duct tape. Now, I actually live in an apartment in San Francisco with no outdoor space, so in the weeks leading up to the show, I was lucky and privileged enough to be sent on an all-expenses paid artist retreat at an off off-the-grid remote location to practice and refine my art. And that's where I essentially got to test all of these components together in advance before actually going on site. This really helped in locking down the camera placement, field of view, cable management, and the overall feel of everything, so the actual site install was as smooth as can be. I drove down to Big Sur the day before the show to set up the installation in advance with my sister Rai. There really wasn't that much extra work that had to be done on site. I was grateful that I planned for most things in advance because that just really allowed me to be much more present and in the moment and just really enjoy the weekend versus being in like work tunnel vision mode.
Let's pretend we're floating over everyone. Let's forget the days, the whole